The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lee Pucker. I'm the CEO of the Wireless Innovation Forum, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on Part 90Z to Part 96 transitions. Before we get started, a little bit about the forum. Our organization's been around since 1996, and the purpose of the organization is to advance technologies supporting the innovative utilization of spectrum and the development of wireless communication systems, including essential or critical communication systems. We're a registered standards development organization with the government, and we currently have around 90 member organizations. Of those 90 members, we had a little over 60 who were participating in the development of the CBRS baseline standards that have been used in the creation of the CBRS ecosystem that's now been approved and is in deployment. There were 376 participants and thousands of hours that went into creating those standards and establishing the ecosystem that we've set up. So with that as background, a little bit of Administrivia before we start. The slides presented during the webinar are going to be available. They're not in the handouts, but they're going to be, there'll be a link sent to you following the webinar, and you can also find them online at wirelessinnovation.org/webinars. This will be recorded on our YouTube channel. The easiest way to find it is to just go to YouTube and search Wireless Innovation Forum, and you'll see all the webinars available in our webinar series. And of course, if you have any questions or need any more information on this webinar or anything else related to the forum, please contact me at lee.pucker@wirelessinnovation.org. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker, Richard Bernhardt. Richard's the National Spectrum Advisor for the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA. He also chairs our Operation Work Group in the Spectrum Sharing Committee, which Spectrum Sharing Committee is the committee within the Wireless Innovation Forum responsible for the development of CBRS standards. So Richard, over to you. One more thing before we go. If anybody has questions along the way, please type them into the questions window on your interface, and I'll relay them to Richard as he goes through his presentation. So over to you, Richard.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to all of you. Hope you're all doing very well. I want to go a little bit farther than I normally do in welcoming this week, because I know many of you are in your homes and sheltered in place or doing something around this lovely time that we're in. So I wish you all well. Hope you're healthy, and maybe we'll provide a little entertainment for the next roughly hour. This presentation, and if you want to move on to the next slide, is about the transition from Part 90, Part 90Z to Part 96 CBRS. I have to do a little administrative myself. Since we are not providing legal or business advice, and the WINForum is a standards development organization in general, we cannot be providing you with legal advice or commercial advice for dependents. So I'm giving you the little legal disclaimers up front. They're up there on the screen. But basically, this is for discussion. I can't guarantee you the accuracy of everything I say, but hopefully it'll give you a basis upon which to ask questions and make yourself a little bit more knowledgeable about the subject. Let's move on to the next slide and get on to the more important things. So we have a full agenda today, and hopefully I can answer your questions. And if you have questions, I'm not going to guarantee you I'm going to stop every time I see one. We may collect some up and say answer them as we go. We may answer some at the end, and we may send you emails with answers if we can't get to them inside the time. But I do want to provide the avenue for that, because this is a somewhat complex subject. It's also not a totally settled subject, and there's a lot of area to cover. So here's our agenda for today. It's an aggressive one. I want to tell you a little bit, and I apologize up front, I've got a little bit of an allergy cough, and so you're going to hear me cough every once in a while. So we're going to go over an overview of what Part 90 Subpart Z NN licenses actually are and were and still are, within 3.65 to 3.7 gigahertz. Then we're going to talk about how the transition moves you into, if you choose to go into CBRS, into the Part 96 FCC rules, which are applicable to CBRS. We'll talk a little bit about how the two bridge each other by grandfathered wireless incumbencies. We'll talk a little bit about the radios, the types of CBSDs, and the radios that are in Part 90 and the radios that are in Part 96 and which can go where. We're going to talk a little bit about transition history and why this isn't an easy subject, why it didn't just happen, and what happened in terms of a waiver petition and a very, very recent order making things very different. And we'll walk through that order. We need to cover what it means to transition from Part 90Z, which is really 47 CFR, Part 90, Subpart Z, and the sections on 3.65 to 3.7 into the equivalent part in 96, which is CBRS. Why this matters, why do you care? Just to give you a brief look at it, there's somewhere between 30 and 70,000 radios out there that are operating presently in 3.65 to 3.7. Most of them are fixed wireless. They fall in topics including WISPs and utilities and energy companies and oil and gas and private uses. And they make up probably a very good portion of what is the beginning of CBRS. So that's why it matters, and we're going to go into some detail on that. We're going to talk to you about what equipment choices there are and some specialized equipment. We're going to talk about SAS engagement. If you're transferring into CBRS, when you have to use a CPI and what a CPI is and what installation of the equipment is necessary. We're going to talk about the transition of old Part 90 equipment. Yes, some of it can do it, but some of it is a very good doorstop. So we'll talk about that. New versus old equipment, can it be upgraded? And then we'll talk about a very weird issue that happens between grandfathered wireless license holders and those people who are registered in GAA within the same region, and any open issues on the ULS. And then we're going to talk about individual waivers. And then I have some slides which talk about moving forward into CBRS if we have time, use cases and things that you can do once you transition in, and a little bit about where the WINForum is going with its release too. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's open things up and talk about CBRS spectrum briefly. Most of you are very well aware of the different areas of CBRS, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the basics of CBRS, but because this is a lecture or a discussion on the topic of 3.65 and incumbent uses inside 3.65 to 3.7, it's important that you know where the spectrum is laid out in CBRS. There are 150 megahertz of spectrum in CBRS in total that run from 3550 to 3700. And if you look at this really pretty little chart, you'll see that the federal incumbents or radio location falls between the entire aspect of that. And then there are FSS, which is fixed satellite systems. These are Earth stations, incumbents, that fall from 3600 to 3700. PALs will occupy when the auction happens. It has now been moved. If you haven't heard, it has been moved to mid-July. But there's a lot of things you have to do in advance. So if you're interested in a priority access license, you better be paying attention to deadlines. But there's a little bit greater window now than there was before. 3550 to 3650. And that little red box, the little red box right next to priority access licensees is the one we care about in this lecture the most, because that is the 3650 to 37 area. And that is what is going to be transitioned. You kind of have two basic choices. You can transition, or you can not transition, or you can go into another, maybe there's a third choice, you can go into another band other than CBRS, but you're not going to be able to ad infinitum continue in 365 under the NN license. So let's move on to the next slide. So what is Part 90 Subpart C? And that's a lot of legalese, of course. But if you go to the legal code and you take a look at 47 CFR, that should say Part 90 Subpart C, you will see wireless broadband services offered in 3650 to 3700. Now, why is it Subpart Z? That's because there's a whole lot of other things covered in Part 90 that are not relevant to this particular topic, and you should certainly take a look at them if you're operating in any of those categories. But today we're going to focus on Subpart Z because that's 3.65 to 3.7, which is the current licensing. And many of you may have been using this for years. It was kind of a light licensed approach to life, where you got either 25 or 50 megahertz of spectrum. You could use it on a non-exclusive basis nationwide. So if your license is still in effect, that is still what you can do. There are exceptions to that, of course, but it is a mid-band spectrum that's used by a lot of fixed wireless organizations. Fixed wireless is a broad term, meaning anything that goes point to point or point to multi-point. So a lot of different kinds of uses. If you look at section 90.1307, you can see that provided for all of the rules and licensing, and that this is a bit out of date because there is now an exception, which we're going to discuss in depth. But I want you to know that most licenses issued after April 17, 2015, more or less came to an end around April of 2020. And there had been an opportunity for a one-time renewal, but Part 90 was modified that basically kept that date. If inside that range of dates, April 15th, 2015 to April 17, 2020, you renewed, they still kept the ending date at the April 17, 2020. And you'll see, I put a little note there, that the extension will make a motion beyond that. And licensees that were issued after January 8th of 2013 were given protection from harmful interference in CBRS. There were additional requirements put into place in 2015 to register them with the ULS. We'll be discussing that. Next page. So this is the codified version. I'm not going to go over it again, but if you look at 90.1319 policies, these are the policies upon which the band runs. And you can see what was required and what is required. It's whether it's mobile or fixed, it has to be using a contention protocol. It's up to 50 megahertz of spectrum. There is some of the licenses were issued for 25 megahertz and some of the licenses were issued for 50 megahertz. So they're kind of all over the board, but they are nationwide, and there is an obligation to try and protect against harmful interference and cooperate. And you'll find that that term to cooperate doubles itself into CBRS later. So that's the basis of 3.6 to 3.7, 3.65 to 3.7. Not going to go into it in depth because most of you aren't applying for the license for 3.6 to 3.7. You're trying to transition. So let's move on. All right, so the part that a lot of people were interested in was the fact that in around 2015 and on, they started to talk about that little Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS. And the FCC, probably alongside the Navy and alongside operators at that time, had anticipated the process might take 2 or 3 years to complete, and we would be off and running, and there would be a buffer period wherein operators with existing licenses would still have license term, probably around 2 years plus, to make a transition. And so they created a circumstance where you could, if you registered your devices in the uniform licensing service of the FCC before April 17th of 2015, this was mostly your base stations or the higher power devices, and you sort of pledged not to do harmful interference to incumbents and work within the terms of Part 90, you were granted incumbent status in CBRS, which meant that you really had status similar to that of a federal agency or an FSS satellite system, and you got protection from harmful interference from the operators of GAA, because it's the higher frequency, from the operators of GAA by the SASs. And this is where it's granted. And you can see the terms and conditions. I'm not going to read through it all, but just understand that grandfathered wireless broadband licensees got special rights. And it's very important to understand how those rights extend forward. Let's move on to the next page. So the incumbents, as I just mentioned, are sort of fall into three categories. First, and maybe the most paramount on this list, are the federal incumbents. And these are radar systems, naval radar systems, shipborne radar systems, some inland radar systems. Everybody thinks these are all on carriers and destroyers, but there are some, especially in training facilities and otherwise, that are fall inside the United States or inside the active non-coastal ground of the United States, and all of them need to be protected. And they are protected by the SASs, who know generally where these dynamic protection zones are. And there is a series of sensing devices called environmental sensing capability sensors, which detect when radars are active and inform the SASs. And they don't particularly want you to know where the ships are for national security reasons. So sometimes what it turns on an ESC is the Navy or the military telling us there might be activity in this area. But the idea is to protect those radar facilities, and the federal incumbents are very high up on that list. Next, there's always been in the band, or has been for quite a long time, about 20 FSS satellite Earth stations in various C-band sites across that cover the spectrum from 3625 to 3610. And they are due a particular type of interference protection and a circumference around them. And then finally, the one that we're talking about today is the grandfathered wireless protection zones. Those are zones that are created with the SAS around legacy Part 90 Subpart Z devices that operate 3650 to 3700. And while most of them were set to expire in March or April of this year, there are some licensees that actually extend out even beyond 2020 to 2023. I think there may even be a few that go out to 2025 or 2026. And again, we're going to talk about the FCC's new ruling extending licensees that may sunset under Part 90. All of those that fell within that followed the rules, they have protection, the grandfathered wireless protection. Let's move on to the next slide. So we talked about Part 90, which is the rules regarding operators and in the 3.65, but 96 is the rules that cover the same areas, but cover it from the perspective of CBRS. And the basic things are that grandfathered wireless broadband licensees get treated as incumbents, which means they get the protection, but they also cannot cause interference up the chain. So a GWBL is not technically allowed to cause interference to federal incumbents or grandfathered FSS Earth stations. Grandfathered wireless protected licensees only applies within grandfathered wireless protection zones. And if you were to get these rights, the Part 90 rule sort of bifurcated. In April of 2015, you had to make a choice. The choice was, do you register your equipment with the uniform licensing system, or you leave them unregistered? If you registered them properly, by April of 2015, you got granted the grandfathered incumbent status. If you didn't register by that date, you did not get the grandfathered wireless protection status. However, your license is still in effect for the NN license that you have. Many people get confused thinking that their license expired because they didn't properly register equipment. There is still a requirement that says that you must register that equipment in order to operate in the band. It just won't grant you the grandfathered wireless protection from CBRS. And most of the GWBZ or the grandfathered wireless protection zones are defined by the access points and the higher power CBSDs, not lower power CBSDs. Grandfathered wireless protection zones must be registered, as I said, in order to get the SAS protection. And the licensees operate these zones under a combination of the Part 90 rules and under the protection of the SASs that fall within the Part 96 rules. Next slide, please. Here's the codification of that. It's really the actual rule. I'm not going to read through it. If you want to look at it, that's a good place to do it. Let's move on to the next slide. All right. So WINForum is this, as Lee said at the top of the hour, is the standards development organization that created the baseline standards for CBRS. What does that mean? It means that the WINForum worked with the United States government, with the Department of Defense, with the FCC, with NTIA, with a whole range of host of organizations, along with the stakeholders or the operators who intended to use the CBRS band or intend to use the CBRS band, in order to come up with a set of common standards that would allow for the operation of the band. If you want to see those, the link is there under WINForum, and it is a really good idea if you're going to be entering the CBRS band to familiarize yourself with those standards. And baseline standards are there. Later on, we'll talk about where WINForum is going with release 2, but the release 1 baseline standards provides a whole picture into the operation that the SASs use, the CBSDs use, what you have to do to install things, how you communicate, almost all the things around CBRS. The fundamental guidance rules are given, as we said earlier, in 47 CFR Part 96, and you can see that at the top of this page. All of these slides will be available, so if you want to get these links, you can use them there. And dead center in the middle is something we're going to talk about a few slides down, which is the OET Laboratories Knowledge Base, or KDB. A KDB is a ruling, if you will, or a issue that's put out by the Office of Engineering and Technology that provides one of two things: a clarification on something in the rules, or a methodology for testing or correcting for testing based upon Part 96 rules. Why is that important? Turns out that a certain segment of the CBSDs required some modification in the understanding of their deployment. They're very critical to the transition between Part 90 and 96. We call them CPE CBSDs over the air, and we're going to discuss them later. And finally, we've talked about the FCC, we've talked about their specialized rules, we've talked about the WINForum. There are also private consortia out there that work on various things in CBRS. The most prominent that I know of is the one called CBRS Alliance, who works on the providers of LTE and NR-based practices, usually 3GPP-based. They have a product called OnGo. So there can be industry-based organizations that do specialized work within the band in Part 96. Let's move on. So what's the history on this transition stuff, and why do you have to do it? So we've already called out where it sits, and then it's 25 or 50 megahertz that was granted. Originally, the licenses were 10 years, and they were able to be renewed. The renewing got changed in Part 90, and you needed to register your devices in order to get grandfathered wireless status. If you've never looked at the universal licensing system, there it is for you, and it is a great resource, not just for 3.65, but for a lot of different bands. And it is the central place that information comes into the FCC on licensed or light licensed use. So if you need to or want to see if your equipment's registered or the date of your licensing, that's the place to go. And I'd go right to that link that I provided there. So the equipment is listed, and there's a docket there that lists which ones are qualified for grandfathered wireless broadband. And there had been expected to be, as I noted earlier, about a 2-year transition. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. And because it didn't happen, the time started to get shorter and shorter and shorter between the deadline of when you had to sunset or your termination of your license in Part 90 occurred and the time that the band would be open. In fact, the band didn't enter ICD until late last year, and the entire full commercialization of CBRS didn't happen until January of this year. So it became somewhat urgent to say, hey, we need a little more time to be able to transition many pieces of equipment. And so on October 4th of 2018, my organization called WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, and a group called UTC, who represents the utilities and a bunch of stakeholders, filed for a blanket petition waiver to extend the deadlines for transition. At the time, for almost 2 years, asked the FCC for some relief. Let's go on to the next slide. Next slide, Lee. Thanks. So inside that October 4th till today, or till last week, the petition status was sort of up in the air. The FCC didn't know whether they wanted individual petitions or they wanted to grant a blanket petition. They never finally gave a response back to WISPA and UTC. And of course, we had some issues occur along the way. So here's the history of this. As I said, full commercial operation of CBRS was granted in January 2020, not 2018. As might have been expected. And a lot of that has to do with delays along a lot of different methodologies, a lot of different areas, including things like testing and government and even stakeholders. But there was a long delay, and the opening of the band occurred in January 2020. The right to transition began around ICD, which was around September, and then full commercial operation in January. That fell right into the beginning of winter season in most of the United States. And transition requires most people to go up on their towers or buildings and change out equipment. And changing out equipment in the wintertime, especially 20 or 30,000 units of equipment, can be an immensely difficult, if not impossible thing to do. The other thing was because equipment was just being tested for CBRS, and there was a lot of other unknown things that came into the band early on, the cost was uncertain. And so they were concerned that making a steep transition very quickly would be very costly, especially to smaller providers. Third, the only kind of CPE that was available, and again, we're going to get into a little more detail about this particular device in a minute, but the only ones that were available basically for client type devices, or CPE, subscriber units, all the same thing under different names, were CPEs that had back wiring, either Ethernet or fiber or some sort of back wiring to them. There needed to be another option. We'll talk about that in a minute. In order to install all of the new equipment, there had to be CPIs available in order to or certified professional installers to add in and create the installation for a massive amount of transitionary equipment. Now we have that. We have a pretty good collection of CPIs across the country, but earlier on we didn't. And then a newer issue that came up was that some older equipment, some of the equipment that is operating in 365 and the NN license, a good percentage of it was WiMAX operation. And some of that equipment was not set up for software-defined changes, which would allow it to be transitioned. And a number of companies have indicated that some of their older equipment, unfortunately, could not be upgraded and unfortunately need to be replaced. So that created a supply chain issue as well. And then just to add insult to injury, because that's what it is to most of us right now, in February of 2020, COVID-19 virus started to have its impacts on China and Asia, and a lot of supply chain came to a screeching halt. And then by March, excuse me, by this month, COVID-19 curtails much of the ability to do almost anything, including installations in homes and residences. Let's move on to the next slide. So the FCC did something very nice, and they did this just literally this past week. They gave an extension allowing Part 90 licensees, these are the people who have 365 to 37, who are the incumbents in the band at the moment, the ability to extend out to October 17th of 2020. And they cite the pandemic and the issues that I mentioned. If you read through the order, you will find a number of places where they cite almost everything that I indicated. And so generously, they gave a 6-month extension, allowing parties to do what they need to do the transition. And they did indicate that they dismissed the petition for WISPA and UTC, but they did so leaving it open. In other words, they didn't close the door completely. Go to the next slide, please. The chairman of the FCC, Ajit Pai, recognizing that this is a major issue, says granting this temporary extension will enable Part 90 licensees to focus on continuing to provide high-speed broadband and other critical services during this national state of emergency. This is a logical delay of a transition during a pandemic and ensures current licensees like WISPs, electric utilities, can keep their eyes on the ball when it comes to helping consumers. We can allow the flexibility while we still maintain reasonable timeline for transition. And I'm pleased that we could find a way to grant this relief without impacting this summer's important 5G auction, which he's referring at this case to auction 105, which is the CBRS auction. Let's move on to the next slide. So within that same docket, they issue of their own accord, which means sua sponte, they did so of their own order, the rules saying that if you were going to expire between April 17th, 2020 and October 17th, 2020, you now have an extension. You have an extension to October 17th of 2020 to make that transition. And as it says at the very end there, because we waived the transition period on our own motion, we dismiss as moot with and without prejudice the waiver request filed by the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association and the Utilities Technology Council for a blanket waiver. But what they say next is that you have an opportunity in the event that the October date doesn't work to make your case. So let's move on to the next slide. Actually, go on to the next slide. I'm going to see if I'm still in order here. So what if I need more time? We may come back to the other one. If it comes to October 17, 2020, and you still haven't completed the work that you have to do, and there's a really good reason for it, not because you ignored the signs and just said, I'll wait to the last minute, but if you actually have a really good reason, the FCC not only left open the door for you to file an individualized waiver with the FCC to extend the time, they exactly told you what you have to do it. If you take a look at the docket order, and you will see that they say, for one thing, you have to plead your case with all the facts and circumstances to warrant such an action. Well, that's not so unusual. You have to go on a case-by-case basis and say that there's a particular need. They should plead with specificity the individual steps to comply with the extended transition deadline and provide details regarding any unique, unusual circumstances that could justify further extension pursuant to the Commission's waiver. And then they go on to say, which is very unusual from the FCC, they give you the reasons why. The licensee's good faith efforts to purchase, install, and test the necessary upgrade equipment required to operate in their network pursuant to Part 96. In other words, you couldn't get the equipment or there was an issue with testing, plead that case. The unique or unusual circumstance that prevented them from completing the Part 96 transition by October 17th. Let's say, you know, we have terrible weather or a hurricane comes through and you really couldn't get it done, plead that case. And then they want to see that you've actually taken steps. So if you're a procrastinator, you're probably not going to win the day. But if you've actually taken steps, you want to demonstrate those to the FCC, show the specific steps that you've done and a timeline that goes with that, and then you can ask for an extended waiver. So you have a couple options there. One is there's an extension due to this horrible COVID-19 virus that extends you out to October 17, 2020. And if you need more time to make that transition, you are also able to petition for individual waivers by the FCC through the waiver process. And I do want to indicate that there were really, as I indicated before, two types of licensees, those that registered their devices and got grandfathered wireless protection, and those that did not register their devices with the ULS, but still had licenses. This extension extends to both. It doesn't change the nature of what your license is. So if you didn't register, you still are able to broadcast in that spectrum, but you do have to protect CBRS entities. If you're a grandfathered wireless protected entity that registered with the ULS, the other is certainly true. You're considered an incumbent until your license expires, which in this case most of them will be October 17, 2020, and you have grandfathered wireless status. So understand this is a very important extension. Next page, please. All right, so you are a current licensed Part 90, but you're not registered in the ULS. So I'm gonna go in a little bit more detail about what you have to do.
We've got a question that came in.
Okay, sure. What is that?
What happens to those operators that fail to start operating CBRS and continue operating under Part 90?
So the operators that have valid Part 90 licenses, and we're just about to talk about the ones that didn't register in the ULS, but this applies also to those that did, you have the right to operate until that license is expired. Now, Some of you had renewed in the past 4 or 5 years, and you may extend out to 2023. And if you didn't fall inside the sunset period, as denoted in Part 90, your license may actually extend out beyond 2020. And you are allowed to continue to operate in the band accordingly. And you take that bifurcation. One direction gives you, if you registered with the ULS on the proper time in 2015, you have grandfathered rights and you are considered an incumbent. You can continue to operate. If you didn't, that's what this slide is about. So if you still have your license and it's still valid, you didn't abandon it, you do register the equipment now, you still have to register your equipment. I want to make that clear. You can't go back and register that equipment and gain GWBL rights, but you do have to register equipment. That's part of the Part 90 rules. You have to be aware of and protect CBRS operators. You can't cause harmful interference to CBRS operators. So one side, they protect you against harmful interference, and on the other side, you're required of your own accord, just like when you're protecting any incumbent, to make sure that you're not walking on CBRS rights. So the answer to the question is you can continue to broadcast. Understand that the SAS will probably not know you exist, because if you're not registered in the ULS and they haven't been informed, and there isn't a zone that's indicated for protection from the SAS is not going to know that you're there, and that's a problem. That is a big issue on interference between the prior incumbents and the new CBRS operators. So you need to walk carefully, because you don't want to interfere with CBRS if you don't have that protection. So let's go into this slide. Did that answer the question for you? Hopefully I covered the ground that you're looking for. The GWBL protection is afforded to those who properly registered, but if you didn't register, as I said, your license still continues. It's just not grandfathered wireless. So your obligation is to avoid interference with CBRS operators, and there's an issue. Operators such as these are just not known by the SAS. So to put it another way, the SAS does not know that those Part 90 operators are there. So you have a higher obligation to protect against creating harmful interference in CBRS. And it is important to note that the Part 90 licensee is not allowed to go back and register their operations in ULS in the hopes of establishing GWBL rights. Next slide, please. All right, how do you transition? Everyone wants to know this. So first off, you need appropriate equipment for operation in Part 96 operation. That means you need CBRS ready equipment. There are a little bit of exceptions that you can find in the Part 96 rules about covering the entire band, but you have to be able to talk to a SAS. And by talking to a SAS, that means that the SAS has to have control of the frequencies you're operating on and the power that you're operating on. You have to work with your existing manufacturers. The equipment that you have on its face is not CBRS equipment, at least not most of it. They need to determine the status and viability of that equipment to make sure, especially the older equipment, that it is compatible with use with the CBRS equipment. If it is, they will have had to gone through some testing, FCC testing and standards testing, to make sure it does in fact work that way and get the appropriate FCC ID. If they don't work and some of the older equipment doesn't, well, it's good for opening the door and leaving the door open, but that's about it. It's not really operating equipment in CBRS. You need to create a good network plan and understand CBRS. Like anything, if you're going to enter a new band, especially one that has some different rules than normal licensed or unlicensed operation, create a good network plan and understand the rules. You need to develop a relationship with a Spectrum Access System Administrator, at least one. You can develop them with many. It's an open market of SASs, and you get to choose which one or ones you want, but you're gonna have to have a relationship with them if you wanna operate within CBRS, because they are sort of the traffic keepers and the rules keepers and the moderators of the band. As I said, all of the equipment that is going to be used on the system has to have its appropriate IDs and protections, and that includes all of the registration information requirements for CBRS registration. And that registration information, for the most part, there are a few minor exceptions, but right now we're not aware of anything that actually falls into that category. Pretty much all Category A and Category B CBSDs not EUDs, we'll talk about EUDs in a minute, but all CBSDs have to have a proper installation by a certified professional installer. So you need to get to know about CPIs and understand how they will install your equipment. They are fixed equipment. This is not like a piece of equipment that you can walk around with. It has to be installed, and the proper information has to be provided by the CPI. And the equipment itself, if it's still operating at Part 90, there may be some issues with operating with GAA, and we'll have a whole slide on that in a minute. And then you have to know how to obtain a grant. So as simple as, is the equipment that I have usable? How do I install it? Work with the equipment manufacturer to make sure it is now up to date and with the right IDs. I get a CPI to come out and install it into the CBRS system. I have a relationship built with a SAS. I get all of the registration data put in by a CPI, and I'm good to go at that point.
So Richard, another couple questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Are ULS registrations automatically identified in the SAS?
No, I wish they were. The ULS and the SAS don't have to compare notes, though I do know some SASs that will be doing that. So the ULS operates as a registered database of the FCC, and SASs can make reference to it, but it's not a mandatory requirement.
Okay. The next one is, if SAS doesn't know that there are older Part 90 operators there, how will those of us that are operating in the CBRS band not get interference from those operators?
Kind of the old-fashioned way. Unfortunately, for a period of time, you're going to have to detect if there's interference going on, and work with your neighbors. So they have an obligation to cooperate in the band and out of the band, and even as a unregistered ULS entity, their legal responsibility, or their responsibility as an operator, is not to interfere. So just as in unlicensed, when someone does something intentionally to interfere, or accidentally does so by pointing an antenna in the wrong direction, you may actually have to physically go out and find those people and work with them. Some cooperation is going to be necessary for a period of time.
Okay. Next question is, should we continue to register in the ULS?
If you have a current license under Part 90, an NN license, and you are putting up new equipment, you not only should, you're required to. So the requirement says that anytime you put up a piece of equipment, you need to put it into the ULS. There will be one exception to that, and that is that if you are going to close down your license operation, then you wouldn't want to register equipment, but there'd be no point in registering equipment that you're not going to use. So yes, the answer is, if you're going to be operating in Part 90, you should be registering new equipment in the ULS. Again, as I noted earlier, you will not get, if you didn't do it earlier, if you weren't part of the registration, this isn't an extension of your registration from April of 2015, that won't kick you into grandfathered wireless protection, but it will meet your compliance requirements for Part 90.
Okay. I think I'll let you get back to your presentation, and then we'll take up some more questions later.
Sounds good. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, now you got to choose some new equipment, and let's talk about that, one of which is called CPE, CBSD over the air. Next slide. So before I get to CPE, CBSD, I know I digress a little bit, but I wanted to talk about what the equipment is that is in the ecosystem for CBRS. And this little chart is quite good at showing where what the different choices are. So at least with regard to CBSDs, which is the basic unit radio device that gets registered with the SAS and operates in the ecosystem. Sometimes these are paired, by the way, with other devices. So your antenna and your radio are considered one unit, and the device itself put together is the CBSD. And you might have a proxy that you use in the system. That's a little different scenario. They have to be tested with the CBSDs to be allowed in the system, a domain proxy. But here's the basic categories. Category A, CBSDs, these are lower power CBSDs, approximately 1 watt per 10 megahertz. And these are units that are allowed indoors. If they're allowed at or below 6 meters height above average terrain, that's what HAT means. And if they're above that, then they're considered category B. If they could geolocate themselves as to altitude, longitude, and latitude, and they don't exceed that 6 meter HAT requirement, then technically indoors, they could be put in without a CPI. But because of the lack of accuracy of GPS as to altitude, there aren't many units that can be installed without a CPI. I'll leave that up to your engineers to figure out. But generally speaking, category A devices, the lower power CBSDs, do require a CPI to install. The higher power devices, which are used exclusively outdoors, which are the category B CBSDs, they go up to a maximum EIRP per 10 megawatts, per 10 megahertz of 50 watts, or 47 dBm per 10 megahertz. And they are not allowed to be operated indoors. They do operate outdoors, and they have the higher power transmission. They can be a base station, they can be a client, they can be a mobile unit, not a mobile unit, they can be a small cell, and there is no specific height unit on them, but they have to be fixed. And every single one of those category B CBSD devices, which are certified as such, require a CPI to install them always. The third type of device that there is in CBRS is what's called an end user device, or EUD. This is a low power device. If you look at the power that's listed there, it's 200 milliwatts. 200 milliwatts for 10 megahertz. That, you might think cell phone, you know, small devices or a small CPE that's reaching out only a very short distance, and those devices can be mobile. And the difference between an EUD and a CBSD is that an EUD is not controlled by or managed by the SAS. It does not register with the SAS. If you think about it, there would be 200 or 300,000 or several million, maybe many million devices like this. It wouldn't be something that the SAS would have localized control of. So a low power device like a cell phone, it can be mobile, but it's not managed by the SAS. Next slide, please. That category that I've been alluding to is called the CPE CBSD over the air. And what does that mean? It basically is a standard CBSD, let's say a category, let's use a category B CBSD as an example. But that device is being installed somewhere where it is unable to talk back to the SAS directly. There isn't a hard channel to the internet. There isn't mobile phone that the CPI can use to register the information. The device itself is sort of standalone, and it's backed up. It operates in its own network over CBRS frequencies. And if there were not some clarification that allowed that to be done in the field, then most rural and suburban deployments, and by the way, this also applies to urban deployments, but for the most part, when this was contemplated, it was contemplating rural and suburban deployments. You would not have a way to actually lawfully register and have the CPI do what they need to do and ask for a grant, because the device itself can't use CBRS frequency until it has a grant. So you go to this FCC knowledge database, and there's the address right there for you. If you just look up CBSD over the air or whatever, you'll find the KDB entries about this. You'll see that there's equipment now being produced and being tested and produced in the supply chain, which allows you to use the access point, also known as the base station, also known as the eNode B, to reference the information out to the internet that's necessary to register the device. And so basically it's a client device, a CPE, that registers via its access point, base station, or eNode B out over the internet based upon rules that are in this KDB, and allows you to get a grant. And it has to be done on the frequency that your AP or your base station is already approved on, so that the interference can be monitored. Next slide, please. Excuse me. And so here's just another look at the same equipment that the Citizens Broadband Radio Service device, I keep saying CBSD, that's what CBSD means, is operated in one of two fundamental categories, a low power category A and a higher power category B. And we talked about what a client CPE CBSD device is, and those little things that we all carry around in our back pocket, the end user device. Next slide, please. So new equipment versus old equipment must be one of the questions I've gotten over the past couple of years the most. Can I use my old equipment that I used for WiMAX? Can I use my old equipment that I bought 2 years ago? Can I do this? Can I do that in order to move into CBRS? The answer is sometimes. The equipment has to be able to be managed by the SAS. It has to be able to meet the out-of-band emissions that are required in the ecosystem. It has to be able to manage the power, and then it has to be able to connect to the SAS. Those characteristics are not as easy as they sound for all radios, even software-defined radios. And the radios that sort of extended back to WiMAX, which may be 3, 4, 5, even 8 years old and older, a lot of them, unfortunately, are not going to be compatible with Part 96 operation. It is very important to understand that Part 96 operation requires certification and testing to make sure that it's compatible with the CBRS ecosystem. Once your manufacturer has identified it as such, gotten the IDs that they need, gone through the testing, then their equipment can be used inside the ecosystem. But if it's not identified and not tested in that fashion, you can't just automatically transition it. And think of it this way, any equipment, even old equipment that is being brought from another unit or another part or another licensing regime into CBRS is, for all intents and purposes, new equipment. And it has to be installed appropriately into the ecosystem. So you probably have to have a CPI do it. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so here's the weird issue. You have decided to transition as you should be. You're following all the rules. You get the new equipment or you upgrade your Part 90 equipment. You go out to the SAS. You have a GWBL. You did all the things you were supposed to do. You put your new equipment up on your tower or on the side of your building or wherever you're going to launch from, and you ask the SAS for a grant in GAA for spectrum inside 3.65 to 3.7. You have the license for that. You have done everything, including enter the ecosystem for CBRS. What happens? SAS says denied. And you look at your papers and look up a little bit and say, well, Richard said I could do it this way. Why do you think it might be that you can't operate inside 3.65 to 3.7? You still have a current GWBL license and you recorded it. And you recorded it in that geography. The SAS knows that you registered that device as solder protection in a GWBZ protection zone, which is around where you are. The SAS is going to protect you from you. So you as Part 90 are being protected from you as Part 96, and you as Part 90 win. So we don't have a definitive answer on the best approach to this. Most likely you're going to have to give up your license through the FCC, but I would consult with your SAS and I would consult with the FCC or with your legal counsel to find out how do you isolate yourself so you're not overlapping yourself and being protected from yourself in the geography and you end up with nothing. It's a weird problem, but it is one that you have to pay attention to. Next slide, please. All right, we've talked about this already. I'm just going to highlight it again. There's basically two types of equipment, and I didn't mention the domain proxy here, but CBSDs and EUDs. And you have to choose your equipment according to your use. Move on to the next slide. So if you need more information about all these things that I'm talking about, I had a slide earlier that has some of this. This actually has links to where the standards are. At WInnForum, we have release 1. and release 2. We'll talk about release 2 in just a moment. We have incumbent data, so you can look up where federal incumbents are and where FSS incumbents are, and you can where to go for the ULS to look for registered occupants of the grandfathered wireless band. You can go to CBRS Alliance and learn about 3GPP based stuff and the OnGo brand and how to do and use protections through CBRS Alliance. You can look at the FCC's equipment search page to find out if the equipment that you want to use has been tested and is available for use. And there's more resources than this, but that's a good start. Let's move on to the next page. All right, very briefly, and then I'm going to get into questions. There's 2 more areas I want to cover. What the heck do you do with CBRS? What are the use cases? You've been using it for certain things in 3.65. Who will want to use CBRS? Probably know the answer to this question as well as I do, but this is quite a list these days. Obviously, a lot of you on the line are fixed operators. Some of you aren't. You can use them indoors and outdoors. WISP operations, indoor networks, including private LANs, extensions of cable network operators, or MSOs, where they take a fixed extension off of their strands. Utilities and energy for smart meters and for regulation of equipment and for SCADA type monitoring things, which sort of falls into the next category, which is Internet of Things. There's the Internet of Things consumer side, IoT. There's the Internet of Things industrial, which is IIoT. IIoT is what a lot of us used to call SCADA, which, although now it's much more robust than SCADA. SCADA used to just be very small amounts of data from sensors. Still can be that, and it can be large collections of that, but now IIoT expands to so many things, including data compilation, use of cameras, smart data, all kinds of things. The industries like dairy and agriculture, industry where they make chips and telemedicine and everything, IIoT is burgeoning. Security and surveillance, use of cameras over CBRS is going to be very robust. Industrial, commercial, and residential monitoring. Agriculture, such as dairy sensors and geofencing and moisture sensors, parking boundaries are another use. And then the more specific uses that CBRS is going to have a good concentration on are things like private networks and neutral host. A private network lets you set up and establish exactly what it says, a dynamic or even a static specific network that runs on CBRS, and it can be isolated from other networks, or it can have a methodology of being integrated with roaming. And that can be an industrial or business or even residential complexes such as MDUs or MTEs. And this goes on. So let's move on to the next slide. And then there's the list of verticals, but I guess you could add any one that you want to this list because this is just examples. Move on to the next slide. All right, so we've covered most of this. I leave this slide in there because it gives all the power requirements for category A and category B and what the rules are about when you can use each. It's a good reference slide for you if you want to know about each particular piece of equipment. Next slide, please. All right, we're now open for business in GAA. GAA is considered a licensed by rule. It is not strictly unlicensed. It is open for who? For anybody. Anybody who wants to use GAA can do so, but they have to follow Part 96 rules. You will have had to make your transition from Part 90 into Part 96 to do this if that's where you're coming from. If you're a new user, you enter by getting equipment and registering with a SAS and following the rules. Since it's licensed by rule, you don't have to buy a license to enter the GAA spectrum, but you do have to follow the rules. And the nice part is we are at full commercialization, which means right now, until the PAL auction, there's as much as 150 megahertz of available spectrum pending other interference mitigation that has to be done with incumbents. Next slide. And then I'm just touching on this for 1 second. You must coexist in the band. And the FCC does not give us a lot of guidance in Part 96 on this. It's a shared spectrum. You are sharing it with incumbents. They must be protected. There is no, that's not black and white. They must be protected. But among generally authorized access users or GAA users, there is no expectation of interference protection from other GAA users. And you may find SASs that are willing to work with you to do some coexistence protection. but be aware that you may have some noise in GAA, and you can read the rest of this on your own time. Next page. All right, I'm not going to go through all of these because I will just step through the slides really quickly and take a couple questions. CBRS standards are there to help you navigate and understand the band, and they are requirements that make the band work. You can find them at the WINForum. The baseline standards were released in 2018, are all there for you to read. Move on to the next slide. These are they. This is what they look like. There's ones for CBSDs, ones for PKI certification, which is the back-end validation side of CBRS. They're there for the training and CPIs, the Certified Professional Installers. They are there for SASs, what they have to do. They are there for CBSDs, what they have to do. They're there for the testing, the air interfaces, and all of the various aspects of the operation. If you ever want to know how to operate in this band, take a look at the standards requirements and baseline standards from the WINForum. Next slide, please. All right. We are looking at some new things in WINForum, including adding features and functionality, additional features and functionality, some of which will require testing, some of which won't. Watch out for what's coming in the future. We're going to try and do as much as we can with self-testing in the industry to make a wide variety of features and functions that can be added into CBRS. Next slide. Here's the conclusions from all of this. A transition must occur, and now you have until October 17, 2020 under the new extension. After that time, you can petition for a waiver for a longer period of time if you need it, or you have to exit the band. If you don't exit the band, then you're subject to operating without a license or operating on a band when you don't have a right. So make sure you do follow the rules on these things. Consult with your manufacturer to see if Part 90 equipment may be used and updated for use in the CBRS ecosystem. Consider your network plan, always consider a network plan. Consider the cost of transition and that you'll have to use a SAS and a CPI, and there may be some additional equipment costs associated with CBRS, but it's a pretty good band. You get a lot more spectrum up to 150 megahertz, and there's a lot of area for growth. Watch for some new features and functionality coming from the WINForum and make your transition a good one. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. The slides will be available whenever you like. And my contact information is, go back one slide, my contact information is there. I welcome questions if people have them. Can't give you legal or business advice, but we can give you some direction. Thank you for listening today. I'll take a couple of questions and then we have to sign off.
Sure. So I'll go through the questions that I've gotten. Can you give up your registered location under GWBL in order to register new equipment with SAS, or will you need to give up the license altogether?
That I don't have a definitive answer for you. The location might work, but the SAS is under the constraint to protect incumbents. So even if you tell them where you are and what power radio you're using and what your azimuth is and all of the information, they are still required under Part 96 to protect you. So most likely you're going to have to notify the SAS that the license is no longer in effect, at least in that geography, or that that equipment is no longer operating in that circumference. That answer to come. We don't have a definitive answer.
Okay, the next question. Is there such thing as a high power EUD?
No. EUD goes up to a maximum power of plus 23 dBm. It cannot go higher than that. If a high power EUD becomes a category A or category B device and has to be treated as such.
Can you just sign up for GAA instead of transitioning from 90 to 96?
Absolutely. You can start out as a new provider, but if you're registered with equipment that's already in the space, then you're not effectively doing that. If you start off clean, no problem. Of course you can do so.
Okay. Are PALs now 100 megahertz of the total 150 megahertz of CBRS?
PALs are afforded 100 megahertz of spectrum totally, but can't occupy more than 70 megahertz of spectrum in the lower band. So they're PALs in any given geography, which is broken out by counties now, If you buy a PAL, you buy them in 10 megahertz increments, and you're allowed to buy up to 40, or bid for, I should say, it's an auction, to bid for up to 40 megahertz of maximum spectrum in any given geography. The 100 megahertz is because there's 3 slots that are left open for if there are issues or other incumbents or reasons the SAS has to shift the dynamic spectrum of the PAL around. When those aren't being used, they are considered GAA spectrum.
Okay. How do we find out if we are grandfathered and not just an NN band holder?
It's sort of up to you to work that out with the SAS. If you followed all of the rules, then your devices are registered in the ULS as of April, what did I say, 15th or 17th of 2015. And if you've been maintaining your license and it's still current, then you are grandfathered and you need to notify the SAS. Sure.
And one last question, and I think I can answer this one. How do I become a CPI? Go to cbrs.wirelessinnovation.org and you can find the information on that website. And I think we can send you the link to there when we send a follow-up thank you for attending the webinar message.
Appreciate all of you who attended today. I know this is a complicated and sort of long drawn out topic. Good luck with your transition. Good luck with coming into CBRS. My name and address and contacts are there if I can be of any assistance. And we'll look forward to the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.